Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here and to talk about the Burgess Shale in this location in particular. I probably don't need to remind some of you that the Burgess Shale is quite close by here in Banff and is something that many people have had the chance to explore. Just so everyone is oriented, the map might be a little bit small, but you can see that within a short drive from here in Banff across the provincial border is the Burgess Shale Center in Yoho National Park. Now, this is what it looked like in the early 20th century upon being discovered for the first time by Charles Doolittle Walcott and his expedition from the Smithsonian Institution, which took place over 5 seasons. Here is a picture of Walcott at one of those seasons. And what was striking to Walcott at the time, and continued to be striking about the Burgess Shale even to the present day, are the forms of fossils that one can find there. So if you look at Doolittle's diaries, which we have here from the Smithsonian, he was drawing these forms, and they could be recognized even now from the fossils that we have. Here are just a few samples of those fossils. From the fossils alone to the untutored eye, it might not necessarily look that dramatic, but when we do reconstructions of these fossils in a marine context where they would have originally been found, we get quite an extravagant picture of what was in the sea at that point in time. Animals that are strikingly different from what we see today and exhibiting features that are quite intriguing in their own right, such as you see in the top right there for Opabinia in its vacuum hose proboscis. Now some of you might be thinking, whoa, wait a second, I came to hear a talk about the Burgess Shale, and all of a sudden he's talking about metaphysics. Somebody did some false advertising. But that's not true, because Stephen Jay Gould, when he wrote this book, Wonderful Life, The Burgess Shale and the Nature of History, was engaged in metaphysics. So if you look at his own words, The Essence of History, its name is Contingency. This book is about the nature of history and the overwhelming improbability of human evolution. Well, when you hear somebody talk about the essence of history or the nature of history, they are talking about metaphysics, claims about the ultimate structure of the world, in this case, historical structure. So Gould is the one who first brought metaphysics to the Burgess Shale. I'm just following in that path. So here's what I want to do in the time I have tonight. What I would like to do is look at Gould's famous argument in Wonderful Life about replaying the tape of life, a thought experiment that has gotten a lot of attention, and I'd like to rehearse that and look at some of its details, and then contrast it with an interpretational challenge that comes out of the work of Simon Conway Morris, the very same paleontologist who originally reconstructed hallucigenia upside down, and also was one of the people who described a large number of fossils in the Burgess Shale in the 1970s and 1980s, and actually into the present day. And then what I'd like to do is talk about how more recent work in paleontology has, in some sense, undermined both of these views, both Simon Conway Morris's and Stephen Jay Gould's, and that's what I'm calling the consequences of successful paleontological practice. And then I'll close by talking about scientific metaphysics, again thinking about the possibility that we might draw conclusions about the way the world is from the successful practices of the science. And I'm going to draw a distinction between epic sagas and short stories, and make a claim about which one of these is better supported by the case study that we're reviewing tonight. So let's start with Gould's argument replaying the tape of life. This is the way Gould himself described it. I call this experiment replaying life's tape. You press the rewind button and, making sure you thoroughly erase everything that actually happened, go back to any time and place in the past. Then let the tape run again and see if the repetition looks at all like the original. Any replay of the tape would lead evolution down a pathway radically different from the road actually taken. So there's two components here. There is the replay idea, and then there is the supposed consequences of what would happen if you replayed the tape of life. Now, in Gould's argument, he talks about this radical different pathway of evolution in terms of contingency, that the outcomes of evolution are contingent. And it turns out that he's not entirely clear in the book about what he means by contingent, and it's worth clarifying the two different senses. Contingency per se, or a kind of unpredictability, where if we knew the prior state, that wouldn't let us know the outcome. It would be insufficient to tell us about that, a sense of unpredictability. And there's also the way we talk about contingent upon, a kind of causal dependence, or how past events condition future events through particular historical pathways. So certain things had to have happened for some outcome to have been manifested later. And both of these are operative in Gould's work. Let me show you a picture of these just to capture the difference between them. So on your left is unpredictability, where you have some antecedent conditions. And from those antecedent conditions, it's unpredictable whether you would get one kind of outcome or the other. In the case of causal dependence, the antecedent conditions are important for the kind of outcome you get. There's a causal dependence on them. So if you have A as the antecedent conditions, you get O, the outcome. If you have A primed as the antecedent conditions, you might get O primed as the outcome because of that causal dependence. Now from this point forward, you can completely forget about causal dependence because I'm not going to talk about it. I want to focus on unpredictability because that's the sense that is at stake, at least in thinking about, I think, the Burgess Shale. What's important about unpredictability is its purported implications. Why did only a small number of body plans or phyla persist compared with the many that arose in the early Cambrian period? So there was that amazing menagerie of different kinds of animals in the Cambrian Sea that is preserved in the Burgess Shale. But we don't see a lot of those sort of forms today. Why did only some persist? Well, one possibility is that the survivors, including our ancestors, were much better adapted to their environment. So, if we replay the tape, we're going to get the same outcome because those who won the first time under the same environmental conditions will win again if the game is played. Second possibility is that the survivors were lucky, winning a lottery among equally if differently adapted forms. So lots of different kinds of forms, but the ones that survived were not necessarily better than the others in some direct competition sense. And hence, if you replayed the tape, you could get a very, very different outcome. The lottery would get shuffled in a different way. Well, we might not only think about the Burgess Shale, but we might apply this in thinking about our own condition as Homo sapiens. And that's what Gould was driving at in his book and thinking about the metaphysical implications, the nature of history, on his interpretation of the Burgess Shale. Why did a fossil form like Pikaia, shown here on your right, the first known chordate and possibly an ancestor of vertebrates, including humans, persist, rather than hallucigenia, or those other forms that we saw swimming in the Cambrian Sea? Gould thinks it's quite clear, possibility 2 is where we should go. Replay the tape 1,000,000 times from a Burgess beginning, and I doubt that anything like Homo sapiens would ever evolve again. So that unpredictability interpretation of the Burgess Shale has implications for us and our place in history as well. A strong contingency in that unpredictable sense. Now, part of the reason why Gould thought this is because he thought the Burgess Shale exhibited a pattern in the fossil record. And the pattern was one that contrasted with what a lot of people have expected in studying the fossil record. So on your left, you see a traditional model where you have a cone of increasing diversity, where from less diverse beginnings over time, evolution generates more diverse, more disparate forms so that that cone widens through time into the recent period. And Gould thought this got it backwards, that in fact, there was a lot of diversity and disparity at the beginning, and that that lottery process removed a lot of it, but not because of being better adapted, but just because of a lottery type process. And he called that decimation and diversification. And so you can see, if you look at those two different tree patterns, right, you get a very different picture of what the fossil record is showing, whether you get lots of disparity and diversity early on with extinct forms, with only a few surviving lineages, or whether you get a cone of increasing diversity. Now we can kind of make this a little bit more concrete by throwing some pictures onto the pattern. Okay, and so here you see some of the Burgess Shale forms represented as extinct lines in the decimation and diversification pattern. Hallucigenia on the far left, as well as several other representatives. And there you can see Pikaia at the base of the lineage that eventually begets vertebrates like Stephen Jay Gould. Or in a different lineage, maybe crustaceans, arthropods. And what Gould was basically trying to emphasize is that on this model, you run the tape again, and that lottery process occurs, you get a very different outcome. So instead of Pikaia surviving, it is extinct, and those Lobopodian worms maybe generate gigantic science fiction style worms after 500 million years of evolution. So that's the basic pattern and why Gould thought it spoke to the expectation that a replay of the tape would yield a very different outcome. Here in his own words, perhaps we are only an afterthought, a kind of cosmic accident, just one bauble on the Christmas tree of evolution. This book is about the nature of history and the overwhelming improbability of human evolution. It focuses on the new interpretation of the Burgess Shale as our finest illustration of what contingency applies in our quest to understand the evolution of life. The animals of the Burgess Shale are trying to tell us something. Okay? Well, some people disagree. So here you see Simon Conway Morris's 1998 book, The Crucible of Creation, The Burgess Shale and the Rise of Animals, which was written in large part to disagree with Gould's interpretation in Wonderful Life. Here's how Conway Morris put it. The reason for discussing convergence here is that its recognition effectively undermines the main plank in Gould's argument on the role of contingent processes in shaping the tree of life. Contingency is inevitable, but unremarkable. It need not provoke discussion, because it matters not. There are not an unlimited number of ways of doing something. For all its exuberance, the forms of life are restricted and channeled. So what I've highlighted in the yellow text is this claim about restricting and channeling and convergence, and what Simon Conway Morris is drawing our attention to is convergent evolution of these types, where you get very similar morphologies in very distantly related lineages. So in the top, for sharks, ichthyosaurs, and dolphins, you get the fusiform body that is efficient in swimming, even though the ancestors for dolphins were land mammals. So there's a distant, very, very distant relationship between these lineages. And then in the middle there, you see for flying, birds, pterosaurs, and fruit bats, and the similarities that emerge for being able to fly. And then in the bottom there, you see the comparisons between placental and marsupial mammals that were very distantly diverged and yet exhibited features such as the wolf and the Tasmanian wolf, or the mouse and the marsupial mouse, almost adopting identical morphologies, living in very similar niches and doing very similar things. Now, these details can be quite striking, and so I've just emphasized some of the external morphology, but the kiwi is a good one to pay attention to see some of the specifics. A bird that looks a lot like a small mammal because of being adapted to a common niche in New Zealand, where there weren't mammals originally. Of course, now there are mammals, and kiwis are not doing so well as a consequence, but that's a different talk. The kiwi has some really unusual avian features: well-developed senses of smell and hearing, a face covered with whiskers, bones containing marrow instead of air sacs, and shaggy hair-like plumage. It's effectively a bird rat. Okay? So Conway Morris argues along the following lines: the constraints we see on evolution suggest that underlying the apparent riot of forms, there is an interesting predictability. This suggests that the role of contingency in individual history has little bearing on the likelihood of the emergence of a particular biological property, illustrated here by saber-toothed cats. On the top, the placental from North America, and on the bottom, the marsupial from Australia. This is the claim, and you will notice it is the exact opposite of the unpredictability claim. So in the unpredictability claim, if you'll remember, we started with certain antecedent conditions, and we could not predict what kinds of outcomes would result. The convergence claim that Conway Morris is making is the reverse. From many different antecedent conditions, we end up with similar or the same outcome as a consequence of convergence. Conway Morris says the reality of convergence suggests that the tape of life, to use Gould's metaphor, can be run as many times as we like, and in principle, intelligence will surely emerge. We muddy the waters of the debate if we fail to acknowledge that the processes of evolution have metaphysical implications for us. So we now have two authors who have made metaphysical claims about what the Burgess Shale tells us. They turn out to offer directly opposite interpretations of what the Burgess Shale tells us. Now, one thing I think it's important before we move on, when Conway Morris says intelligence will surely emerge, he does not mean necessarily Homo sapiens like us, but rather some kind of humanoid with our intelligence, and so you might let your imagination run riot here in terms of what that might have looked like. Alternatively, this might be the stuff of nightmares. But anyway, the point is just that it's not the same thing as saying that identical lineages, Homo sapiens, is what's being claimed. All right, so now we've seen two contrasting views. What have we learned from more recent successes in paleontological practice? Well, one key thing has been a change in taxonomic methodology, a major revolution in how paleontologists and biologists more generally reconstruct relationships between animals and plants and other organisms. This is from Derek Briggs, who was also one of the people who described a number of the Burgess Shale fossils, and in a more recent article said, since 1989, cladistic analyses have accommodated most of the problematic Cambrian taxa as stem groups of living taxa. Now, what he means there is, he says, that original interpretation that Gould was highlighting, where there were all these weird forms that then somehow were decimated and we no longer see, turn out to be more closely related to the forms we now see than we originally thought. And what that implies is that Gould's argument is undermined because it undermines a critical part of his interpretation of the Burgess Shale. In order for that pattern of decimation and diversification to have occurred, for you to have that lottery sense of the Burgess Shale that would then have implications for us, is undermined because it turns out that the species that went extinct at that point in time are actually not so far unrelated from those that we see today. And one component of this was a key development in the conceptual practice of paleontologists, which Briggs and Forty refer to, the stem group, crown group distinction. So what is this distinction? Well, by way of illustration, let me try and show you. So what was introduced into cladistic methodology was a way of separating long extinct groups from more recent representatives. So in this example here, we see Hallucigenia as a member of the stem group Onychophorans, and a velvet worm, an extant group, a member of the crown group Onychophorans. And what this particular conceptual practice allowed paleontologists to do was to recognize the relationship between Hallucigenia and contemporary velvet worms, while also recognizing that there were major differences between them, as opposed to thinking that contemporary velvet worms are completely disconnected from lineages like Hallucigenia. And we can do this for all of the Burgess Shale fossils. I'll just show one more example. Here's the dramatic fossil reconstruction of Animalocaris and a contemporary crustacean. And now it is thought that the Animalocaris is a stem group arthropod, fitting in the total group of arthropods and compared with crown group arthropods like crustaceans and other things, insects that we're familiar with today. So this was quite critical of a development. It was not available to Gould as directly when he wrote the book because it had not been fleshed out in practice. That was something that occurred in the intervening decades. But what it ended up doing was pulling the rug out from under some of what Gould needed in order to make his interpretation of the Burgess Shale. Now, I think there was a larger conceptual shift in this move in practice, and it was a shift from thinking about wholes to think scientists are now using to reconstruct relationships, encouraged treating taxa, the whole, as aggregates of traits, that is, their parts. Okay, so how do you reconstruct the relationship between Hallucigenia and a contemporary velvet worm? Well, you have to scrutinize the parts, and you use those parts in aggregate to generate those relationships. So instead of looking at Hallucigenia as this weird whole, you zoom in and look at the spines or the appendages and use those to reconstruct the relationship, and it turns out that's what allows you to recover that stem group, crown group relationship. But I think more intriguingly, this broader conceptual shift has led to some major advances just in the last 5 to 10 years in what we can say about chance and evolution. And this is why I think it matters. Body fossils, whether the Burgess Shale or otherwise, are parts of whole organisms. And assessments of morphological change are mostly based on single traits. Right? Oftentimes, you don't get that much when you find a fossil, and you have to reconstruct the lineage, a whole, in terms of a part. But it turns out that single traits show conflicting patterns of evolutionary mode in the same sequence. What do we mean by evolutionary mode? We mean, is it under selection? Is it chance? Is it something else? It turns out when you look at single traits, it changes over time. It's not one or the other, it's them in a certain kinds of combination. And what's even more intriguing is that that conflict increases with the number of traits measured, so that you see mosaic patterns of trait evolution common in the fossil record. So if you look at one part, it's under chance processes, another part is under selection, another part is under chance, and then over time it changes. One's under selection, one's under chance. And so that mosaic pattern is happening through history. Now this undermines Conway Morris's argument, because it undermines his interpretation of the Burgess Shale fossils and what was going on at that point in time. Now let me give you a pictorial illustration of this just to make it a little bit clearer, hopefully. So what we have in mind when we talk about single traits is that when you look at a fossil whole, you're zooming in on the behavior of particular parts. So in this case, we see a fossil fish, and we see the taxa represented in different sediments of the stratigraphic column. And if we were to focus on the eye width, the purple, what we would find is that it's undergoing gradual change towards an increased eye width. Okay? But if we instead turned our attention to the pectoral fin length, the red, we would find that it's actually being held relatively stable, exhibiting a form of stasis through that same period of time. And then if we turn to the tail fin length, what we would see is that it's actually exhibiting a random walk, the formalization of chance in these models. And so this is what we mean when we say, instead of talking about the whole organism being subject to selection or subject to chance, what we're finding is that you have to zoom in on the parts, and the parts tell different stories. Now, when you do that for lots of traits, you end up seeing a pattern like the following. So here the gray dots represent well-supported hypotheses about what kind of evolutionary mode traits are experiencing, and you can see there is a cluster of traits that are stable, that is, they are not changing and they are undergoing some kind of stasis. You can see a cluster of traits that are experiencing chance, they're undergoing a random walk. And then we can also see that there are a number of traits that are undergoing directional change. This requires extremely rich fossil records in order to do this kind of quantitative analysis, but this is the cutting edge of what we're seeing in that move from wholes to analyzing parts. Now, I think Doug Irwin has captured this nicely in a recent review of Wonderful Life After 30 years. He says it seems unlikely that there will be any general answer to questions over the role of contingency versus necessity in evolution, either with the Burgess Shale fossils and the Cambrian radiation specifically, or more generally in the history of life, in large part because at such a coarse level the question is wrongly specified. The relative importance of contingency depends upon whether one is interested in molecular processes, development, phenotype, or macroevolutionary patterns, and the answer may differ at these different levels, even for the same event. So instead of generating a single story of chance or a single story of convergence, we're getting a very mixed story, and it depends on how you ask the question. So now let me turn back to a more philosophical vein about scientific metaphysics. Both Gould and Conway Morris offered grand visions of ultimate reality through their divergent interpretations of the fossil record. Remember Gould's claim, the essence of history, right? And the contrast from Conway Morris was, that's not the essence, this is the essence, right? They were these grand competing visions. I think these visions are akin to epic sagas that provide a global interpretation of evolution in the history of life on Earth. And I choose epic sagas because I think in those literary genres, we see some of these characteristics that both Gould and Conway Morris wanted for their interpretation of the Burgess Shale and evolution. So an epic is a long work portraying heroic deeds and adventures or covering an extended period of time. And a saga is a long story of heroic achievement, a long involved account of or series of incidents. Some of those will be famous and familiar to you, such as the story of Sigurd and Fafnir and the Icelandic sagas, right? Lots of examples we might highlight there, but the important thing is that it's a big story, a very big story that you're trying to tell. However, I think the subsequent successes in paleontological practice that we looked at were the result of a shift from looking at wholes to focusing on parts, both in terms of the cladistic methods that are being used and analyzing the evolutionary mode of single traits. If successes of the sciences are one good place to work out the ultimate structure of reality, that is metaphysics, then a lesson we can draw is that the implications in this case are better described as short stories, where a short story has a fully developed theme, but is significantly shorter and less elaborate than a novel or epic saga. So when we look at the pectoral fin length of a particular fish taxa in the fossil record, we can develop a rich account of that particular trait. It's just not the global epic saga, essence of history kind of account that Gould or Conway Morris wanted. So maybe by contrast, we get something more like the Cask of Amontillado from Edgar Allan Poe, one of my favorite stories. So, conclusions. Do the exceptionally preserved fossils found in the Burgess Shale tell us something about chance, contingency, evolution, and history? I think the answer is yes, though not in the form of an epic saga that Gould or Conway Morris argued for. Instead, I think successful paleontological practices yield rich short stories that are more circumscribed. They tell us something, but they don't tell us the large-scale form of an epic saga that might have been hoped for or expected in some respects. So do the Burgess Shale fossils imply that we are here simply by chance, or instead a predictable outcome? Well, what we've seen is that both of those extreme global interpretations don't work out. They're both epic sagas that turn out to be undermined by the latest successful practices, and that in fact, there's much we can learn about chance and predictability from the themes of short stories that emerge out of the empirical study of evolutionary modes for single traits. And that is work that's ongoing, but I think worth paying a lot of attention to and telling us maybe a different metaphysical implication than Gould or Conway Morris might have had in mind. So with that, I just wanted to highlight that the story I've been telling you tonight is drawn from a number of different sources, which I have benefited from. And I will say thank you in particular to Doug Irwin and Scott Lidgard for their help with the slides and assistance in all things paleontological. Thank you. So we cannot recover molecular information from strata of the age of the Burgess Shale. DNA just doesn't last that long. So in some sense, what we have two sort of strategies. One is to use the current molecular data that we have in reconstructing sort of patterns of evolution on certain assumptions about how fast DNA changes over time. So that's one strategy where we're using the molecular data in the present to try and at least recover some story about the past, despite the fact that we can't get that molecular data from the past. The other, I think, important strategy is one, like I described for the evolutionary mode of single traits, and what that requires is looking for very good preservation through time that will allow you to do that kind of analysis and get a better sort of account through time of what's going on. Because of course the Burgess Shale is a kind of snapshot, right? You're getting a, here's what was there in that one event when the mudslide buried everything at that point. So I think that we are able to use both of those things, contemporary molecular data and these richer fossil record strata, to build a better account, but ultimately there's a lot of data we wish we had that we don't. And that's just the reality of history, I think. Good question. Please.
There are fossil sites all over the world. Why is this debate seem to be centered on the Burgess Shale? What's special about it?
So I think that at this point in time, many paleontologists would say that the Burgess Shale is not as special as it used to be. There have been many fossil finds around the world, especially in China, that have not only corroborated but actually shown us richer diversity in some respects than the Burgess Shale. I think that the Burgess Shale is iconic in part because it was picked up by the scientists and discussed in this context of somehow having metaphysical implications for who we are as humans. And if that had not happened, I don't know how famous the Burgess Shale would be. The Burgess Shale was discovered in 1908, 1909, and nobody knew anything about it. And I don't think many people knew much about it even after Conway Morris had reconstructed hallucigenia upside down. You could have read about it in Scientific American in the late 70s, but it didn't have that iconic status until it was sort of elevated by Gould's book and the ensuing conversation. And I think it's important that even though Gould turned out to be wrong, in some sense he spurred people to figure it out. That you might argue that he threw down a kind of gauntlet, and by doing so made the Burgess Shale famous. And brought it into maybe a kind of fame that doesn't necessarily attach to all fossil sites that we might look at. I think that you can even see that by the fact that most paleontologists are quite, who work on this time in the Cambrian, are quite comfortable talking about comparisons between different sites, but most people who have only heard of a little bit about the Cambrian, they know for sure about the Burgess Shale. That's the thing they remember. Lauren?
Why are there so many fossils from ocean-type animals in an area that seems so far from the ocean?
Good question. Well, since I'm not a geologist, I will not go through all the details because I might mess them up. But the important thing, of course, is that where we are now was not here at the time of the Cambrian. In fact, this region was about in the equatorial sort of region in a gigantic landmass. And what we're seeing is the uplift of these ocean communities that were basically offshore this large continent. And so as the continents moved through time and then were pushed together in a certain way, in this case yielding mountains, we get the exposure of those fossils in this particular place. So that's how marine fossils occur at the top of a mountain from a long time ago. Good question. Mhm.
If Gould were alive today, what do you think he would say about the conclusions you've drawn here?
Would Gould have something to say? I think we can be pretty confident
Yeah.
that he would have something to say. What he would say, I do not know, because we do know that he was aware of the developments in cladistic methodology that occurred prior to his death. So some of those were things he could have been aware of, and we at least have some idea that he was. But the kind of developments that really solidified things, I think, largely we can think about those as being consensus after he died to some degree. So what would he say? I think he would probably disagree, and I can tell you for sure Conway Morris is still alive, and I'm sure he would disagree with what I've said here. But I think that that ongoing debate is a debate that occurs at two different levels. One of those levels is going to be about the sort of knowledge structure of the science and how do we know we have a good account of the fossil record and our interpretations of it. And then the second level is the metaphysics implications. And in most of the discussion among paleontologists, it's in that first level in thinking about the epistemology. And only in a few cases have you had this sort of gloves off metaphysical battle. And that really, I think, is an interesting moment in the sort of history of science when two scientists who are relatively well known and both eloquent and able to write about these things in a certain persuasive manner come out and take diametrically opposed positions. And I think the lessons that I'm trying to draw out are what happens when you see that in retrospect. And what Gould might have thought about that in retrospect, I think is an interesting question, and I think I better not speculate. Yes?
Did Conway Morris look at the Burgess Shale fossils and think that they were more similar in form than Gould did, or was it more a question of reading convergent evolution, looking at the examples today?
So that's a good question. In an important part of Conway Morris's argument is an appeal to the fossil record and organisms today outside of the Burgess Shale. Gould, I think, would have made similar arguments for his position in terms of thinking about mass extinction events and things like that. But yes, it's true that in both of these cases, the perspective on the history of life, the Burgess Shale looms large in the argument, but is not the only piece of evidence that's being drawn on to make that claim. Yeah.
You talked about the reconstruction of these organisms from the fossils. Could you say a little bit more about what that involves? Because it seems like it would be a tricky task based on the sort of two-dimensional, slightly warped nature of them.
So to say that it's a tricky task is an understatement. First and foremost, I'll point you to both Gould's book and Conway Morris's book, where some of the specifics of how they do this is described in detail. In particular, Conway Morris's book is very good about showing how particular methods were used to recover three-dimensional shape from two-dimensional fossils. In fact, one of the things that turns out to be relevant is they're not entirely two-dimensional. There is three-dimensional shape in some of these fossils, and that's one of the preservational richness dimensions of the Burgess Shale. But it's a combination of knowledge about how organisms can be, so what we know from extant marine invertebrate and similar taxa, and then an awareness of how to look at those fossils and interpret them based on long experience that paleontologists have about what kinds of things get preserved, what kinds of behavior things exhibit under certain kinds of compression, so you can actually have certain expectations about what this will look like when it gets squashed. But the reconstruction process, as I mentioned, oftentimes takes years. In fact, Conway Morris published the first description of one of the Burgess Shale fossils in 2010. So, I mean, it's still work being done. It takes a long time, and is done by many different workers, and then is also subject to challenge. That is, somebody can come along and say, I think you may have reconstructed this incorrectly. But the community shares a certain set of methods that they agree upon as being reliable in doing that reconstruction. And that's what allows them to do evaluations of whether a reconstruction is good, whether reconstruction is maybe built on thin evidence or built on thicker evidence in terms of how confident you can be in it. And those are part of the established stable practices of paleontology. But I would definitely point people who are interested to look at the Conway Morris book on the Crucible of Creation, where he goes into depth about how they did some of these particular reconstructions. Mm-hmm.
Yes, Dr. Love. I would like to know if you could be any animal from the Burgess Shale fauna, which animal would you be and why?
This is probably the deepest metaphysical question that one could ask about the Burgess Shale.
Burgess Shale fossil?
Yes, this is definitely above my pay grade, I believe. I think that my answer is wrapped up in the choice of something that maybe not everybody has seen, which is, what do you choose for the picture of your profile online, right? And if you were to go into my Gmail account, what you would see is a picture of hallucigenia. Thank you.